All right. Well, hello, everyone, viewers of my channel, Corluda's Thesis, and I'm here with Weston from Weston Heart's Words. So welcome to people from my channel and people from Weston's channel, both of whom will certainly be watching this. Weston and I have done a buddy read of a book called My Bright Abyss, Meditation of a Modern Believer by Christian Wyman. And we are doing a Zoom chat about the book. And one thing that we thought would be particularly interesting about this whole buddy read and conversation is that I am an atheist. I identify as an atheist, and I do not go to church. I'm not religious, but Weston is a Quaker, but also has an interesting background. And so to start us off, I thought that we could both talk a little bit about since this book is very much about Christian Wyman's own religious faith, in particular as it relates to the modern world and to poetry. I thought that we could both start the conversation by talking about our own backgrounds with religion. And I thought Weston could begin, since Weston's background is a lot more interesting than
mine. Thanks, Lukash. So just my hello to everyone. I'm Weston. My channel is Weston Heart's Words, but I'm sure there'll be links. And also, if you're watching from my channel, yes, you did. And if you're watching it on my channel,
what did I call it?
You said what? Well, you said Weston Heart's Words. That's right.
Oh, I did. Oh,
you got it right. Yeah.
Okay.
And if you're watching on my channel, you already know me. Oh, and by the way, this is for maybe Midrash. I just want to make that clear, that in honor of our really cool reading month for religious writing. Okay. My background, though. So I was raised in a household that was, I would say, pretty secular. One of my parents is a Catholic and the other is a Lutheran, and I can't tell you which is which I think should give you an indication about the degree to which religion was important in our household. I wasn't really raised to believe a particular set of beliefs. And actually in my early adolescence, starting to come of age, I really leaned into kind of the new atheist sort of thing. So, Richard Dawkins was a big influence for me. He was probably the biggest influence. And I guess like Penn Jillette, the magician, he's like a borderline new atheist, but those were writers who I really admired. And I was very into new atheism. I did bounce around a little bit. So I kind of joke that I was, and this is a theme that Wyman comes to in the beginning. So I was thinking about this. I would like to joke that I'm kind of an atheist that was looking for a faith. So I was really into like Enlightenment era deism briefly. For probably a year or so in my later teens, I was really into Taoism as an atheistic faith. And then, in undergrad, I studied the Bible a bit in a required class. I became really interested in Christian theology just academically. And then my senior year of undergrad, my roommate, or one of them, they went to a Quaker high school, Friends Academy. I found that was a really common thing, that Quakers like to run schools. There's a lot of those. And they were telling me about how Quakers worship and that they sort of sit in silence for like an hour. And I just thought that was kind of weird. So I was like, I'm just going to go. So I went to undergrad in New York at NYU. And so I went to, I'll say the Friends meeting because I really like them. The 15th Street Friends meeting, or the 15th Street Meeting House. I went to a meeting, and I had probably what you could call a sort of religious experience or a religious awakening. It's a very nebulous thing and it's hard to articulate. But I felt really touched by that experience in a way that really no other thing had come close to. So I started attending regularly. I went basically every week, with only a small gap when I began my MFA program. And then I haven't gone since the beginning of the pandemic, when in New York it was really bad. And I haven't gone back since. And I never became a formal member of the meeting, though I still call myself a Quaker, because membership is really more of an administrative thing. It's not, it has no real spiritual benefit theologically. So yeah, that's kind of where I'm at in my journey.
Is the version of Quaker, I don't know if Quakerism is a word, but is the Quaker denomination that you see yourself as a part of, are they one of the ones who have the priesthood of all believers? I know some Quaker denominations are like that.
So they I believe theologically, hopefully no more conservative or Orthodox Quakers get mad at me if I get this wrong. I believe the doctrine is in all people who are, so the official term is Friends. It's called the Religious Society of Friends is kind of the name for this movement, this religious movement. I believe the doctrine generally holds that in all variants of Quakerism, that the priesthood of all believers, that all people are entitled to or are able to preach the gospel. But there are differences. So like the liberal friends is sort of what I'm associated with. They will do what's called unprogrammed worship, where everybody sits in silence, waiting for God to move them to speak. But more conservative friends, or Orthodox friends, I believe that's the proper name for them, they will have what's called semi-programmed or programmed worship, where there is a pastor who gives a sermon. But I believe doctrinally, they do still believe in the priesthood of all believers. And I think programmed or unprogrammed, well, I'm not going to try my hand at the theology and the disputes with that, but I believe everyone still does believe in the priesthood of all believers, and pastors are there more as more articulate. I don't think there's any special spiritual access that pastors have in Quaker traditions.
Right. Okay. I was just curious, because I had a Mormon friend growing up, and obviously they also have the priesthood of all believers. But then you have the everyday members who are ordained as a priest of the order of Melchizedek, I think it's called. But then you also have the bishops, and then you have obviously the prophet, the president of the church. But anyway, exactly. Yeah. So to talk about my background, so it's a bit less interesting, although now that you articulated it in so much detail, I'm realizing it's actually quite similar, but with a very different end spot. Although it hasn't really ended, really, because it won't end until I'm dead, I suppose. But so I was raised in also a very secular household, although my brother and my dad were they weren't, I don't think, aware of the new atheists that much, but they would have sympathized with the new atheists and they still would sympathize very much with new atheists, I think, although they're slightly more respectful, I think, than new atheists, but they're pretty anti-theist, that word that Christopher Hitchens wanted to make a thing that never became a thing, because it's kind of dumb. But anyway, they would be pretty close to that. And my mom is a bit more I don't know, my mom's vague about it. I think she's a little bit spiritual, but she's not a part of organized religion. And most of my extended family is also non-religious. My dad's family is from communist Czech, well, they're from the Czech Republic, but it was communist when he was young. So religion wasn't a big part of their lives anyway. But so I grew up in a very non-religious household, and I was the one person in the house who was fascinated by religion and interested in religion. And I learned a lot about religion when I was very young. I had this encyclopedia of world religions that I like to say I carried it around like a Bible, so to speak. And I was just fascinated by religion. And when I was in my later teens and in part of college, I had a kind of unsophisticated, rudimentary faith or idea of God, but it again wasn't all that sophisticated, I think, for a long time, I would have called myself a pantheist. This idea that God sort of permeates everything everywhere. And I was actually also incidentally very attracted to Taoism, but for probably a bit of a different reason, just because I liked it philosophically. Yeah, so I for a while had this like vague idea of God, and there were times when I thought I might like to start trying to go to a church of some sort, but it just never happened, I think, because I don't speak the language in a way. But then in my like senior year of college, I read, I think, what are the two books that kind of put things into sharper focus for me. I read, on the one hand, Thus Spoke Zarathustra by Friedrich Nietzsche. It's obviously kind of a ur-text of atheism, not, well, maybe of new atheism too, although I wouldn't throw Nietzsche in with all of them. But it's very much an atheistic text. And then I read a book called The Case for God by Karen Armstrong, which is kind of the opposite. This book all about how different people have conceived of God throughout history. And in it, she was kind of trying to push back against the new atheists specifically, and argue that this model of God that they all argued from was just simplistic and kind of childish. And the idea of God that she puts forth in that book, I found a lot more believable and interesting and thought-provoking and profound. But it actually sort of was the nail in the coffin for me personally with God, because I kind of realized, okay, I get what God is, and I get the feeling that leads people to God, but I feel that feeling and don't feel the need to approach it with God. I just feel that I can approach it as myself, I suppose. And I guess that's actually a kind of a nice segue, because Christian Wiman kind of talks about that at some points, where he seems to suggest that approaching the world only through your sense of self can lead to kind of a self-absorption, it sounds like. But anyway, so that's my background. So now that we talked about ourselves, we can talk a little bit about the book. Did you want to open with a point, an opening argument, so to speak?
My neighbor has a dog, so if you hear it barking, that's what that is. Yeah, so I don't know if I have an argument per se, although I do think this would be a good place to start. And Lukasz and I have very specific specific threads that we picked up on in this book that we want to talk about. But I think one helpful place to start would just be general kind of reactions, and maybe picking apart, what are those threads that kind of pull us in that direction. So, I know in preparation for this on Voxer, Lukasz, you responded really positively, at least to the first part of the book. That was when we first checked in. I don't know if that's still how you feel. That's good. I had a slightly more mixed reaction to it, which is surprising considering Wiman, for people who aren't totally familiar with Wiman or the book. Wiman is primarily known as a poet. The basic arc of his life, as he kind of presents it in the book, is being raised in, I believe, a Baptist family, sort of spending a period of time as an atheist, or quote unquote like faithless, although he thinks that this idea of faithlessness is impossible. That it's not possible to truly be faithless. And then he's kind of returned to Christianity later in life. I think actually 7 or 8 years before the writing of this. When he
was diagnosed with cancer.
When he was diagnosed with cancer. And the title comes from the title essay, My Bright Abyss, which was written 7 or 8. It was published originally, I think 7 years before this book, which itself is like 8 years old now. And so I wanted to give that background just for people who aren't familiar with the book. I find a lot of his ideas compelling and really interesting when it comes to, I think specifically when it comes to the relationship between the individual and belief in something, in God, right? Because Wyman spends much of this book not really, I mean, I feel like he really starts to home in on Christianity later in the book as sort of this particular kind of faith. And he spends a lot of the beginning parts of the book talking about, at least it's my read on it, that it's more like faith in God, broadly speaking. When I say my reaction was muddled, and I'd be curious to know what you really strongly responded to, Lukasz. I picked up more on I think those statements about belief or faith, and frankly a little bit less so about when he starts, because part of this book is a memoir about his relationship to faith, but also kind of this work of literary criticism, I would say, about faith as it obtains in poetry. And I am a poet by profession, allegedly, as much as one can be a poet by profession.
You have some poems published, so
I do.
Poet by profession.
Yes, by profession. I actually tended to have more issues when he started. I had more issues with his literary criticism, and that I was a bit turned off by. Well, we can get there, but yeah.
Well, okay. Sorry, I was just about to say that so I have two things, one of which is less of a criticism and more just a reservation that comes from the place that I approach this book, and the other one is the one where I disagree with Wyman. So I am a little bit puzzled by his take on Wallace Stevens, who is, and I'm a little bit defensive because Wallace Stevens is my favorite poet. But I find that at times he doesn't give Stevens enough credit for the levels that he's working on in his poetry. He talks about this great line from my favorite poem of all time, Sunday Morning. The line goes, "Death is the mother of beauty," and I find that Wyman is like, he interprets that line differently from how I do, I guess. Like that the way, like he seems to think that the interpretation of that line is that if you look at life through the lens of death, then it'll just make everything more beautiful. And then I mean, I would not presume to invalidate his own experience, because then he talks about the day he was diagnosed with cancer. So like obviously I have nothing I can't deny that, obviously, but I think that that's just a radical oversimplification of that line and the whole poem for me. I see that line as kind of this idea that transience is what makes things beautiful, and Wyman himself actually says some variation on that, because I think at one point he says something like immortality would make the world unbearable or something like that. And I was just like, well, that's what Wallace Stevens was saying, and that's what you're saying. So anyway, so his take on Wallace Stevens would be the one thing in the book that where I was just like raising my eyebrow. But anyway, I don't want to spend the whole time talking about what I criticized about the book.
Hi, Bessie.
So let's talk about the faith, this idea that everyone has faith, because that was something that I also wrestled with a bit, and I wrestled with it in a much more positive way, I think. But he says on page 7, faith in God is in the deepest sense faith in life, which means that even the staunchest life of faith is a life of great change, which I like the sentiment. But it's just interesting to me because when I hear that being said, I say, okay, well, I guess I'm an atheist, but I do have faith in, I guess, certain things, faith in life, like he says, faith sort of in people, which isn't the same as saying that I think all people are wonderful. It's just saying that I have faith in people, faith in art, I suppose. And he seems to suggest throughout the book that that kind of a faith is faith in God. I just don't realize it, which here I am sort of griping with him again, feels a little bit patronizing to me as an atheist, you know?
Yeah.
But anyway, I blathered on. So what?
Oh, no, I mean, I was just going to say that, so I mean, I guess maybe we're just gonna we'll start foregrounding taking Wyman to task. No, so I those are precisely the moments where I felt a bit frustrated by Wyman. I think that Wyman, how do I put this sort of delicately? I think that those moments where he says, you know, everybody has faith in God, even if they don't realize it. I think he there's sort of an attitude, and you kind of said of, I think, did you say paternalism or sort of or like patronizing? Yeah, patronizing. I do get the sense later in the book, and so this is when I say it later in the book, I start to lose him a bit. There is a degree to which I think Wyman has almost defined religious faith and defined Christian faith in such a way that he's almost defined the terms of the debate such that he is right, or rather that his particular vision of Christian faith is not just the correct version of Christian faith, but is in fact the only path from an individual to to God. The reason why I say this is because, and he briefly says this in a later part of the book. He commits this sort of mistake that I think a lot of people who are trying to be I don't want to say be polemic, but rather, stake a claim, which he is doing, whether he realizes it or not. He makes this mistake of acknowledging almost like the error of the project, but then still doing it anyway. And the specific thing that he says, and I wish I should have been slightly more prepared and had the specific page for this, but there's a point at which he says that, he spends a lot of time in trying to figure out his faith, defining what he doesn't believe or what he doesn't hold with, and not enough time really staking a positive claim of what his relationship to Christ actually is. He sort of vaguely gestures at it throughout the book, but at least to me, in the later essays, there are 6 essays in this book, and they're varying lengths, but the later ones, like the last 2 or 3, I don't know, it almost seems like he spends the second half of this book kind of setting up pretty much like knocking down different versions of faith that he doesn't quite like. And I find that attitude relatively, I don't know, I guess the first essay, My Bright Abyss, it is so introspective and is so honest about his own personal grappling with finding this faith, that I don't know. I'm sort of rambling and blathering a bit, but I guess my thought is Wyman spends a lot of time in the later parts of the book almost laying out all of the ways in which he thinks everyone else is doing it wrong, and that could be an uncharitable reading on my part.
I saw all of that as kind of a criticism of the way religion is practiced in a lot of places in America today. Because I read a lot of those passages about him sort of criticizing the way some people go about their religious faith, and I was reminded of another book by Karen Armstrong, The Battle for God, which is about which is a history of fundamentalism, and the development of fundamentalism. And I was just reminded of how she talks about fundamentalism in that book, in the way that he criticized a lot of other practitioners of Christianity. And so I saw all of that as kind of a pretty explicit just criticism of fundamentalism, mostly fundamentalist Christianity, as we see it on the right of the political spectrum mostly. So I suppose I didn't have as big a problem with that, but I'm also not a Christian myself, so I don't. There's no room for me to feel like he's calling me out.
Well, yeah,
except
yeah.
when he
I
talks
mean,
about atheists.
right, yeah, and to be clear, and I also want to say, I think that anybody who's sort of interested in an artist's relationship to faith should in fact read this. I think it's a worthwhile thing to read. And so if you do that, what you'll see is like, the things that he is identifying as being either false forms of faith or in some way flawed. It's hard to put into words because I don't actually disagree necessarily with what he's saying. And actually, I don't feel that he is sort of trying to crowd me out, but rather I think that the fundamentalist forms of Christianity that he is trying to, in his mind, maybe push against, to me it seems the unifying principle that he often comes back to is the two themes that I think he picks out in these fundamentalist forms of Christian faith are self-assuredness or self-righteousness in a way. A theme that he constantly comes back to, I think, is the sense that like secure faith is kind of not is a flawed form of faith. That's like my rough encapsulation of it. And then the second thing is is sort of a form of being exclusionary, right? Like he's like there's one essay in this book where Wyman sort of details his return, quote unquote, to faith. And although there is a beautiful passage in the beginning on that same page, on page 7, that I love, that that phrase "returning to faith" he thinks is problematic. But his second re-entry, or a second entry into Christianity, he presents the story of this pastor at this church down the street from where he and his wife lived, and how the thing that kind of brought him into Christianity again was this very was this sort of openness, right? The path, like both an openness and an acknowledgement of difference, right? The pastor, in talking to Wyman, who was really struggling with the medical treatment for his cancer, there's this really tender moment where he talks about the pastor, running into him on the street outside, and just kind of looking at him, and they have this moment where where the way Wyman interprets it, there's this like unspoken sense in which the pastor is acknowledging the physical pain and the psychological pain that Wyman's going through, and it's the thing. I think the things that Wyman is trying to articulate in this book are very hard to articulate ourselves. But yeah, there's just this moment of sort of sympathy and care without the need to like assert that it is, that it's known. And the point of all of that was to say that I think that Wyman, in some points in the second part of this book, I think he tends to this kind of, it's almost kind of like the paradox of like tolerance or intolerance, where I think for me, I think Wyman was sort of slipping into that sort of exclusionary mode of thinking about faith that I see as kind of troublesome. And he also does this literarily, and I have more issues with that. But that's a very long ramble.
I think I'm starting to see. I think I'm starting to see what you mean. Because when he brings up a lot of these poets, a lot of these poems, he will quote a poem, and he will either say, this is a good example. Well, he won't say this prosaically, but he'll say, this is a good example of blah blah blah. or he will quote a poem and say, oh, but what he or she gets wrong is da 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 da. And again, he's not wording it nearly as prosaically as I'm wording it. I'm not doing it any sort of justice, but I see what you mean by that, like sort of saying, oh, well, this person is right, this person is wrong in the way that they express their faith, which is interesting given how much he talks about the sort of subjective experience of all of this, right? I think he like Marilyn Robinson, who I'm also reading a collection of essays by right now, are very much they very much want to rehabilitate our own subjective experience in how it tells us about the world. And so, but in it, and it's in opposition to, as they see it, this sort of neo-Freudian / neo-Darwinian / behaviorist / whateverist idea of the human mind that says, well, everything is down to selfish desire, and that's true whether or not you realize it or not. And I mean, I agree with that criticism, although I think that sometimes they oversimplify the opposition's argument. But it is interesting that he has this idea of the importance of the subjective experience of faith, but then is doing what you're saying with these poets and saying, oh, well, this person gets it right, this person gets it wrong a little bit. But yeah, I guess I hadn't quite looked at it that way. It's an interesting point.
Yeah, like, and when you were talking about Wallace Stevens, like, there's that moment where he said, and I think I have an encapsulation of this criticism, and also when when we like put this up, I'll try and find timestamps for different things. So if you want to jump around, that might be helpful. Because I think the thought that came to mind as you were responding, I think the way that I would try and encapsulate what I'm observing about Wyman's ideas about faith, at least in the latter half of this book, although it's kind of throughout, is that I think he almost mistakes expression for substance, meaning like he, as you said, he will quote a poet, and I was thinking of the moment in the second essay, Sorrow's Flower, and if I can get a page number for you, because this is specifically about Wallace Stevens, when he quotes, I don't know if he quotes the entire poem.
Page 25. I have it marked, page 25.
Yeah, where he gives us all, yeah,
he gives us the whole poem. Tea at the Palace of Hoon.
Yeah, Tea at the Palace of Hoon, and he gives us a paragraph before the scene break, but this is the first moment where I think a red flag went up for me about Wyman's approach. Right after this poem, the entire sentence reads, "Beautiful poem, fatal belief," and then he kind of goes on from there to try to explain what he means by that. But there is something that feels a bit, I think, the thing you said earlier was that Wyman might be just being a bit uncharitable to Stevens, and that like kind of like underappreciating the full scope of what Stevens either was trying to do, or even what the actual experience Stevens was capturing to begin with, right? Yeah. And this is what I mean by mistaking expression for substance. Like, he takes these poems and then sort of projects onto them and says, this is what the poem is trying to demonstrate.
Interesting. Yeah.
And that's sort of my instinctive thought. And I have some other stuff about poems, but I don't want to monopolize our time with.
Yeah. No, that's a good point. And I hadn't, it's making me want to reread the book and see what I think about what you just said, but because I hadn't looked at it that way at all. But I like that. What was I about to say? Yeah, because again, he does occasionally touch on this idea that and I've already mentioned this, so sorry for repeating myself, but he talks about how if you approach the world only through the lens of your sense of self, then at some point that's going to lead to some kind of, I guess, self-absorption or something like this. And it seems like this underhanded underhanded just reservation about atheism as a whole approach to the world. And I mean, obviously that poem the reason he's sort of criticizing that poem, the reason he says it's a fatal belief, is because it's kind of encapsulates that. But that seems like another example of what you were saying, of like, oh, this is a fatal belief. So yeah. Anyway, sorry, that thought didn't turn into anything, but
oh no, I totally see what you mean. I think that he, and I think that's really my biggest quibble. It's more of a methodological thing, or on the other hand, he'll sometimes make these, in poetry, we talk about this a lot, this concept of things being earned expressively, meaning like, oftentimes when a poet is drafting a poem and they're trying to arrive at a particularly surprising ending or a particular turn of phrase, one thing that we'll often say in like workshop is, is this moment earned? Have you earned it? This often will happen with epigrammatic kind of lines or direct lines that reflect some kind of wisdoms. I was thinking about this because he talks about Rilke later, or like 2/3 of the way through. And in the poem, the Archaic Torso of Apollo, which you may know, I don't know if you do or not. It's probably Rilke's most famous poem, where the speaker details this statue of the torso of Apollo, in fine detail, and we're just really focusing on the statue, and then the very last, and translations differ widely, except for the very last grammatical sentence, which is right at the very last line, where all of a sudden you just get, you must change your life, period. And that's like, and so that's a moment where we think about, does it make sense that we've arrived there? And I think that and I think my thought in this book is there are many moments, to be clear, where Wyman, I think, earns these moments of trying to stake a claim about faith, especially in like My Bright Abyss, the title essay. But I do think there are some other moments where he just kind of says things, and it feels less like wrestling and more like him trying to just like present something about faith. But
yeah, no,
yeah,
I mean, yeah. That's interesting. Yeah, no, I mean, I think I can see what you mean. Sorry, I just turned to my notes and I saw a note where I wrote under the essay "Mortify Our Wolves," which actually I thought was one of the most powerful essays. He talks about compassion versus pity, getting pity from people versus getting compassion from people, and the fact that pity is never actually for the person who is suffering. It's always for the person sort of perceiving them or talking to them. Whereas compassion is for the person who's suffering. I don't know. I like that point, but it might be an example of what you mean. But so we've been giving Christian Wyman a hard time so far. So let's talk about a few things that we liked. Something that I liked was close to the end of the book. And I don't know whether it's one of the things maybe you were also, the thing that I really liked was that was when he said that the reason he's a Christian is because of Jesus calling out, oh God, why hast thou forsaken me, on the cross. I really thought that was a powerful sentiment. He admits that a lot of Christianity doesn't make a lot of sense to him. A lot of aspects of Christianity to him are just nonsensical. And like, obviously, as a non-religious person, I kind of sympathize with that. But this idea of this man, Jesus, thinking of Jesus as a man rather than as God or the Son of God, just calling out like that, despite the fact that he knows he's going to be resurrected and he's going to sort of save the world, so to speak. I thought that was extremely powerful, and I never quite heard it put that way, because that's one of my favorite moments in the Bible. Obviously, I read the Bible as more of a work of literature than a holy text. But that's one of my favorite moments, just because it's so visceral and powerful. And
I'm just trying to, do you have the page? I've been listening. I've just been trying to find the page that where he starts talking. He comes back to it a few times. Was that in Mortifier? This was in Mortifier Wolves, right?
I think that was page 155, I think.
Okay, let me just look at that. Yes, I'm a Christian not because of the resurrection, and not because I think Christianity contains more truth than other religions. I'm skipping some parentheticals that he makes. And not simply because it was the religion in which I was raised. I am a Christian because of that moment on the cross when Jesus, drinking the very dregs of human bitterness, cries out, my God, why hast thou forsaken me?" And then there's really funny parenthetical when he's like, I know, like he's quoting the Psalm and, all of that, which I thought was really funny. Those are moments like that. I think, to be nice to Wyman, those moments I think are very well earned and frank.
Like when he briefly talks about the parables, Jesus telling the parables, and then being like, oh, I'm gonna tell you these parables, but only you are gonna know the meaning of them. And then then Wyman is just like, well, because I feel like why he says something like, oh, well, the meaning of the parable seems apparent. So either he's explaining it because I can't remember how he words it, but he makes a parenthetical statement about how the parables might be just a sign of Jesus's own sense of humor, rather than anything else. Sorry, I butchered.
Oh yeah, that, moments like that, like there's like, I think it's these moments of, I don't even want to say like, I'm gonna use the word humor, but in the very old sense of the word humor, like kind of the sense of good-naturedness, or sort of like, there's an earnestness to it, but there is a degree to which Wyman is very like, like he kind of knows what he's like he knows what he's talking about, in the sense of not just being knowledgeable, but he knows the ground that he's treading on. And in moments like that are I think one really great example of that. And I think this is the thing that I really loved, and that's the thing that I really wish he did more of, was those moments of, maybe I'm just asking him to write a straight up like devotional book about why he loves God. But I know that's not really what this is per se. So I don't want to punish Wyman for writing a book that I didn't expect him to write. But I really love that moment where, partly because it really does reflect my own relationship with Christianity, where I think, for me, that's exactly why I find the Bible compelling as a literary work, but then also why I think Christianity is such a compelling faith, on its own terms.
I have thought about this a little bit in the past, and I think I listened to an interview with Christian Wyman like way back in the day, before I had ever read any of his books, and he does talk about how like the figure of Jesus and the whole passion narrative, the resurrection, is kind of unique in world religions in a way. And I know that saying that, like, I'm in very bad company when it comes to people who've said things like that, but I'm not saying in the sense that those people are saying it. I'm just saying,
right,
anthropologically, the phenomenon of Jesus Christ in this one religion is kind of unique. You have in a lot of religions a God coming down in human form. You can look at the Buddha, who isn't exactly, or Siddhartha Gautama, I guess, who isn't a God in human form, but he does sort of go through a sort of passion, almost, of attaining enlightenment in a way. You have like Krishna, who is a embodiment of Brahma, I believe. In Greek religions, you have like Hercules, I suppose, but they're not quite the same, because none of them is executed as a criminal. None of them is born as a peasant. It's just, it is a unique thing to have the supreme God of your religion actually come down as just this so-called lowly person and die an agonizing criminal's death, it is unique. And I mean, I think it seems like the book is a testament to why a lot of people do find it really powerful. I mean, if, but just to add the caveat, just so people aren't like leaping on my back about saying all these things about Christianity, I'm certain that if I knew more about other religions, I would find things that were unique about them as well that can make them very compelling. So anyway, but yeah, Jesus is a fascinating figure, and he's a fascinating literary character too. I feel like in our popular culture, somehow we've gotten this idea of Jesus as like this sort of gentle, compassionate, kind person who's like very this calm teacher, so on and so forth. And then you read the Gospels and you're just like, this guy is like, he's abrasive, he's demanding, he is kind of arrogant. He seems to think a lot of the people around him are idiots. He is a tough person, and that's I think why I love the movie The Last Temptation of Christ. And I think it captured that aspect of Jesus Christ so well. And I think Kristen Wyman touches on it as well, where he says he does not regard Jesus as a moral exemplar. He doesn't think of him that way, which I thought was a really provocative point.
I love that. Yeah. And maybe that's me betraying like a latent thing where I really like him when he's saying things that I feel as well. So if there is a little bit of that, if you watched up to this point and you think that I'm just just agreeing with things or liking parts of this book that I agree with, feel free to call me out on that. But no, I do. That was a moment where I really, I didn't just find it relatable, but I also found it compelling as this thing that I think stands contrary to most, I'd probably say pretty much all ways in which Christianity is popularly practiced today. Meaning, I think, like a lot of American Protestant churches and traditions often are based doctrinally around Jesus as a teacher. And when you look at a lot of translations of the Bible, you'll either get it, they'll refer to him as teacher, or the Messiah. Messiah, that's a different kind of concept, but or like rabbi. And like I think the Message translation of the Bible calls Jesus like they call him rabbi, or instead of Lord, they'll call him teacher. When I think that whereas like I think a lot of like the Roman Catholic faith, Wyman doesn't talk about Roman Catholicism much at all in this book. He talks about some like historical figures in Catholicism, like the German, who I think was a Catholic priest.
No, he was Lutheran. Bonhoeffer.
Oh, he's Lutheran. Lutheran.
Yeah.
But I don't. unless I'm wrong, Lukasz, that Wyman doesn't spend a lot of time specifically talking about the Catholic variant of Christianity. But even in Catholicism, the Catholic Church. I'm not going to speak to Eastern Orthodox, the various Orthodox churches, because I'm very unfamiliar with that. But I know the Roman Catholic Church spends a lot of time doctrinally on the passion itself, which I think comes close to what Wyman talks about here, the suffering that Jesus experienced. But I think that the way that it gets framed in a lot of Catholic teaching is also this kind of exemplar almost of like the Jesus suffering as like as an act of service, right, for the world, dying for your sins. This is just a common, Christian doctrine too. But what I think Wyman really taps into, and what I really like, or what I find compelling about how Wyman talks about Jesus is Wyman is very much attached to as you kind of said, Lukasz, like Jesus is like as the like, kind of abrasive radical that he would have been historically, but also as like in these moments, like a genuinely pitiful, abject person, human being who is suffering, and who is, in that last moment of the last words that he says of crying. Well, he says like, "It is finished." I think that's the last like recorded line in the Gospels, unless I'm wrong. But the one that often gets quoted is that. But yeah, it's like this. It's this moment of like horror at what's happening to him. It's not really. It's. I think what Wyman really points out, which I think is really amazing, especially for a poet who we often think about poetry as being about kind of beauty. This moment is not really a beautiful moment of pain, and like it's not really. One thing I appreciate about what Wyman says here, and since I'm jumping around a lot, but Wyman talks a lot about pain as sort of not being like an artistic thing in a way, like he's very much interested in physical pain as this thing that is very I don't know, like it's not beautiful, it's not poetic, it's this very like this it is a thing which isolates you from the rest of from the world around you. And on that same page, he talks about the physical pain Christ goes through, or Jesus goes through, to be as neutral as we can. Jesus goes through as this thing which isolates him from everybody, including God. And now I'm rambling, but
No,
yeah.
No, I think that's a good point. It is interesting. Again, I hadn't quite thought of it. Well, people had talked about it before, but I hadn't quite thought of it quite this deeply before. But it's interesting that we have so much literature about psychological pain, emotional pain, so on and so forth, and yet somehow, after however many thousands of years we've had writing, we don't have a particularly good language for talking about physical pain for the most just visceral, universal, animalistic kind of pain. We somehow still don't know how to talk about it. I think that's pretty crazy.
Yeah, absolutely. And and I think it's telling that even in the Bible we get we get these descriptions of we get it's not in like complete gory detail every single aspect of the passion, but we do get some details of what happens to Jesus, right? Like the like getting stabbed with the spear in the side.
You just have to read about what dying from crucifixion is like.
Yeah,
one of the most agonizing ways to die.
Oh, absolutely. And I think that the point of all of this is that in the Gospels, which I go to them because they're sort of like the foundational text for especially at the very least for Protestantism, as like an account of the ministry of Jesus. But we never really like Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John never really attempt to describe what it actually feels like to have like the feelingness of it is the best way I can put it, which is this concept we use we talk about in philosophy, like there's like what it's like to actually experience that, apart from that we know that it's bad. Like we get descriptions of injuries and we get descriptions of like the fact that Jesus is in pain, but the Bible itself, I think it itself kind of admits that there really isn't, we can't really directly access that, because and the way I think about that is in relation to what Wyman talks about, right, which is the body in pain is one that is kind of alone, and that you can't, and that these things, at the very least, as you said, Lukasz, we haven't successfully found the language for it yet. At worst, it could just be that it's impossible to actually articulate it. But
yeah.
But yeah. So I definitely think that those are the things I really love about Wyman, is I think he really, I appreciate that what he identifies as important to him about the Christian faith is almost kind of like the ugliest and like least attractive element of the life of Jesus, right? You know, unlike, say, maybe the Catholic versions of the Passion, which I think are often, you know, like the crucifix, you see Jesus bleeding on the cross, and it's very iconographic. Whereas I think what Wyman is really interested in here is like the actual feeling of dying,
Yeah.
you know, instead of what it looks like. But yeah.
Well, anyway, you know, I feel like I could go on through a lot of different points in this book, but I think we should probably cut ourselves off. But it's been a great conversation.
Yeah.
So anyway, thank you everyone who watched this long. I think we went on for an hour.
Yeah.
And anyway, we'll talk to you later.
Yeah. Talk to you later.